Hey guys, welcome back to another video. You join me out in beautiful, sunny Brazil. I'm about an hour north of Sao Paulo. For those of you that don't know, Sao Paulo is the birthplace of Ayrton Senna, who is, well, my hero, and I'm sure a lot of your heroes too. So it's amazing being out in this country. I can't believe it's the first time I've been here. The reason I'm out here is both Volkswagen Brazil and Volkswagen UK are celebrating their 70th anniversary, which is a huge milestone. And in fact, last night they celebrated in style and put on an incredible show. My main focus for this video is a quick first drive on the car that is behind me. It's a Polo GTS, and it kind of sits below the GTI, although we don't get one in the UK. This is a popular car out here in South America. So I'm interested to sort of get under its skin quickly in the time that we have and see what it's all about, because if you convert its price, it works out about £23,000. So that makes it about £6,000 cheaper than the current Polo GTI. Volkswagen Brazil actually have a number of unique models over here that we just simply don't get in the UK or most of Europe. Under the bonnet we have a 1.4 litre TFSI engine, so it's essentially a 4-cylinder turbocharged unit. Produces 150 horsepower, 280 newton meters of torque. So not massive numbers, but this Polo only weighs about 1,200 kilos, which in today's world is really impressive, because although it's a Polo, as we know, cars have grown, and this is about the same size as, let's say, a Mark V Golf. All of that power and torque runs through a 6-speed conventional torque converter automatic gearbox and is fed to the ground through the front axle. This has a claimed 0 to 62 figure of about 8.3 seconds and will go onto a top speed of roughly 130 miles an hour. So it's quick enough, it's powerful enough, but I personally love the fact that it's only 1,200 kilos, because lightweight gives good feeling in theory. Hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate that and feel some of it on the surrounding roads here, because the roads are not the best, and from what I've seen they're not the widest either. So I'm sure it's going to be a short test drive, but we should get half an idea of what it's like. This entire car and engine were assembled and built out here in Brazil. The car was done in the factory that we actually visited yesterday, and we picked the car up from this morning, and the engine was built at another factory. They have 5 factories over here, and they've been producing cars in Brazil since 1959. And in fact, Brazil was the first Volkswagen factory outside of Germany. They employ 13,000 people. I believe that figure includes the 478 dealer network they have. So you're starting to understand how big a deal Volkswagen is out here in Brazil. And only last month they celebrated building 25 million cars since they opened here in 1959. That's a lot of cars. And another stat is the Polo, maybe not this flagship GTS, is the best-selling car in Brazil. Believe it or not, it is essentially their winter out here, and all of the locals have been complaining about how cold it is. As you can probably tell by my shorts and t-shirt, my deck shoes and my sunglasses, well, it's not actually that cold. It's currently 23 degrees. It was about 25 earlier on. So it's nice and refreshing to get inside the car and talk to the camera. I'm gonna have to have my sunglasses on because the sun is so bright out here. It really, really is. Didn't get a chance to talk about the styling on the outside. I haven't driven the new or current Polo at all, and I think they look spot on. Dare I say it, I think they look better than the Mark 8 Golf. And in fact, they very much remind me of the Mark 7 or Mark 7.5 Golf. And they're probably my favourite Golfs, at least in the modern era. So in terms of looks and aesthetics, I think it ticks so many boxes, the Polo in general, and this GTS, well, it just adds a bit more flair to it and certainly looks more like a GTI. In fact, that's what I thought it was. my lack of knowledge when I first got out here, one of my first questions was, what is the GTS? I could have Googled it, admittedly. And then I found out that it is more of a watered down version of the GTI. I was going to start with driving position and cabin infotainment, but actually, as we're going over some monster speed bumps, let's start with talking about ride quality. I believe we're on 18-inch wheels, which aren't massive, but they are pretty big on a Polo, and they definitely suit the way this car looks. While we're talking about wheels, let's just talk about ride height, because from the outside this car does look like it sits quite high, definitely higher than an equivalent Polo GTI. So I'm not sure if they've lifted it a little bit for your typical South American road, which, let me tell you, isn't much worse than your typical UK road these days, or your typical South American speed bump. This is one of the smaller ones. We went over some absolute monsters earlier on, and I said to the guys in the car that I was with that if I was in either my M2 or my M3, I would be stuck on the speed bump. I'd literally be there like a seesaw. So maybe they have purposely, again, lifted it, adjusted it for this market, which does make sense. So it maybe sits a little bit higher. In terms of driving position and the cabin in general, well, driving position feels pretty much like it does in every other Volkswagen Group car these days. Something like a Golf R that I was in Sweden with beginning of this year, again with Volkswagen UK, my favourite press trip in terms of driving to date. Seats really nice. Again, I think they're pulled straight out of like Golf GTI seats. They're very supportive, very comfortable, and do the job very well. In fact, them being cloth, well, I suppose if they're leather as well, they heat up rather quickly because they're black. But I guess if you lived out here, you're always going to try and park your car in the shade, especially during the hotter months. In terms of infotainment, well, we have a unique one in this car compared to what we get back in the UK. This is actually called Volkswagen Play, and it's designed and manufactured out in Brazil. It's similar to what we have back in the UK, but it has different functions and features, none of which I'm really familiar with. We did go into, let's call it a classroom yesterday, and learn a bit more about it. Its connectivity, the way it works with modern day apps, the way it can be integrated into different countries and climates. For instance, obviously, Brazil, they use Waze a lot, and in countries like India, I think, where this is also sold, they don't use Waze, so they change the apps around and make sure it suits each country and climate. It seems pretty functional and easy to use. I'm not the biggest fan of touchscreen stuff, as you probably know, and it doesn't have a normal volume controller. It's all touchscreen electronic, so not sure I'm the biggest fan of that, but I do have it on my steering wheel controls, and this steering wheel is lovely. Again, it's like going back a generation. It doesn't have all the haptic buttons that are in the current Mark 8 Golf. I'm not sure what the current Polo GTI has, but I much prefer this as real buttons, and they're inbound from the rim, so you're not fouling them and touching them by accident. As we go over yet another speed bump, I don't think I'm really going to get the opportunity to test this car's performance, to test its acceleration or its handling, because these roads are very limited and primitive, and yeah, there's not really much of an option. As I said in the intro, I'm literally leaving for the airport in about 20 minutes, and I thought I needed to get a video from this trip so I can share what we got up to yesterday. And in fact, that's quite a good segue to talk about what we looked at the factory, because there's lots of various elements. Obviously, the main one, which every manufacturer talks about, is sustainability and how the future is looking. And it's very interesting looking at it from Brazil, or let's say from South America, because this is a very unique country, by which I mean they get an awful lot of rainfall and an awful lot of sunshine, and therefore their power supply in Brazil 65% of that comes from hydroelectric, so water, which is, as far as I know, one of the top 3 countries in the world. And it's a massive country, as we all know. So it's not like a small, unique island that has lots of waterfalls and whatever water power. It's a massive country that has a 65% power ratio from water. So that in itself is really interesting and good to hear, because that is undoubtedly clean energy. So you'd think something like an EV would work very well out here. And in fact, yesterday they launched the ID.4, which is the first electric car that Volkswagen have launched in Brazil. I personally don't think it's going to sell that well, and I think they predict it's only going to sell a couple of hundred units in its first year. Firstly, because of price, and that's an issue globally. You know, EVs are not cheap. And secondly, because of infrastructure. Again, that's something that is a common issue in the majority of the world, especially out in places like Brazil. You know, when you're out in a remote place like, well, this isn't even remote, we're an hour away from Sao Paulo, but it's relatively remote, and there's certainly no chargers around here that I can see. But the third one being that Brazil grows an awful lot of sugarcane. They have the space, they have the climate, and they grow a lot of it. And what does that mean? Sugarcane is the key ingredient for ethanol fuel. And in fact, if you go into any petrol station out here, you'll find that they also sell ethanol. And people will fill their cars up, if they can, with ethanol, if it's cheaper than fuel, or regular fuel. Or they'll use regular gasoline if that's cheaper. And they kind of mix and match depending on what cars they drive. The majority of modern Volkswagens on sale in Brazil have something called flex fuel engines. This car has the 1.4 litre TFSI, and that's a flex fuel engine. What does that mean? Well, it means it will run on either ethanol or regular petrol. And therefore, yeah, if one is cheaper, you use that, and vice versa. Hopefully you can see where I'm getting here. So essentially, they use their sugarcane to produce this ethanol fuel. They produce that through manufacturing, mostly powered by hydroelectric. So it's all a very clever ecosystem, but something that only really would work out here. So when you start bringing and introducing electric cars into that equation, well, at the moment at least, it just makes no sense at all, because their whole ethanol approach is incredible, really. They're utilising and making the most out of what this country has and what it produces in its ecosystem. And yeah, I think it's a brilliant, brilliant solution, but it's not one that unfortunately we could copy in the UK, or the majority of Europe couldn't copy either, because we just don't have the land mass available to grow sugarcane. We don't have the climate. We also don't have that incredible 65% of hydroelectric. But it's just a really nice, let's call it microclimate, even though this place is far from micro, study to look at, and something that has opened my eyes to realizing that every country around the world, we all have different climates, and EVs aren't the solution for every single country. Another interesting thing that we looked at yesterday was the use of simulators. Now, manufacturers, racing teams have used simulators for years, but Volkswagen Brazil are taking it to another level. Obviously, they're very useful for things like styling and aerodynamics, etc. That's something that's not necessarily new, but we put on some virtual reality headsets yesterday, which were certainly the next generation to any that I've tried at home, and sat in what I thought was a real car, and it helps Volkswagen Brazil build interiors, make sure they're ergonomically correct. You can test out so many different configurations by playing with computer programs, as opposed to having to wastes lots of materials and obviously lots of man and women hours building these things. You can just run it all through a program and test it out virtually, which is just bizarre. And actually spending some time with that headset on, what was scary was when I took that headset off, the real world seemed more confusing to me than the virtual world. I mean, they could play around with cabin ergonomics, look at blind spots. You could sit in the back seat, pretend that you're a child, because I always go on about that with a lot of family cars. When you've got small kids in the back and you've got these high door sills, if they can't see out, then they're going to tend to get car sick, because yeah, that's just what happens. So all of these small things that I hadn't thought about, they can all be tested virtually now, which is really interesting. They take all of that simulation a step further. They even crash test cars via computer programming. It is really fascinating. I find that part very interesting, and obviously being someone who likes and enjoys being on simulators, Gran Turismo and stuff, and I truly believe that games like Gran Turismo and good simulator racing games teach you a lot about car control. Not everything, but a lot, and that's kind of similar to what they're doing. You know, it's not perfect, but it is helping with a lot of the process, and at the same time it's not putting as much carbon into the environment, not costing them an arm and a leg. So that means that they can make sure that the customers get the cars a little bit cheaper, which is really important, especially out here. Their current interest rate is about 15%. And obviously most of their cars, just like they are in Europe, are financed. So yeah, it's quite horrifying when you look at the average wage out here, what some people must spend on cars. So it's all about keeping those costs as low as possible. Anyway, I feel like I've talked enough. Hopefully I've managed to bring you along for some of this crazy whirlwind 2-day trip to Brazil. I've had a fantastic time out here, as always with these press trips. I've not stopped, and I actually can't wait to get on the plane in a couple of hours time and just turn off, relax and sleep through the night on the way back to the UK. But what a place. If you're thinking about coming to Brazil, it's just lovely. Typically my GoPro overheated just as I was about to finish the video. Just wanted to say once again, thanks to Volkswagen Brazil and Volkswagen UK for looking after me over the past 48 hours. It's been absolutely awesome out here. Really enjoyed it. Love the country, love the food, love the people, and really loved seeing what Volkswagen Brazil get up to in their own unique way. The cars that they make, the cars that they produce, and everything else that goes on behind the scenes. So massive happy birthday, or happy 70th anniversary to Volkswagen Brazil and Volkswagen UK. And thanks a lot for watching, guys. As always, apologies if this video has been a little bit choppy. I've basically tried to make the most out of a slightly tricky situation. It's not my typical car review, but yeah, hopefully you've got a taste of what it's been like to drive this car and what I've been up to over the past couple of days. I'll see you all at another video very, very soon. Thanks as always for tuning in. Cheers.